Marcus Redbone Carter and Derek Blueface Johnson, two names that carved fear into the streets of South Los Angeles. One ruled with raw violence, the other with cold calculation, and together their deadly rivalry turned neighborhoods into battlegrounds, leaving behind a trail of blood, betrayal, and a final twist no one saw coming. In the late 1980s, South Los Angeles was a place where survival depended on the colors you wore and the block you called home. For many young men, gangs were not just a choice, they were a way of life. Out of this world of poverty, drugs, and desperation rose two of the most notorious gangs in American history, the Bloods and the Crips. Among them, two names would become infamous: Marcus Redbone Carter of the Bloods and Derek Blueface Johnson of the Crips. Both men were young, ambitious, and consumed by the desire for power. They saw violence not as something to avoid, but as a tool to gain respect, fear, and dominance. Redbone was born into hardship. His father was absent, his mother worked long hours, and the streets became his teacher. By his teenage years, he had learned that fists and guns solved problems faster than words. His loyalty to the Bloods was unshakable, and his leadership skills made him stand out. Soon he rose to a position of influence, commanding respect from older members and drawing new recruits with his fiery personality. To the people in his neighborhood, he was both protector and predator, keeping rivals out while ensuring that his crew controlled the flow of drugs and money. On the other side of town, Blueface was carving his own path. While Redbone relied on intimidation, Blueface built his empire through strategy. He knew how to form alliances, how to manipulate smaller gangs into working for him, and how to spread the Crips' reach beyond their traditional territory. His sharp mind and ruthless heart made him a natural leader. He understood that reputation was everything, and he crafted his with precision. A Crip with ambition was dangerous, but a Crip with patience was even deadlier, and Blueface had both. Tensions between the Bloods and Crips had always existed, but in the late 80s, they began to reach boiling point. Small fights turned into shootouts, and shootouts turned into funerals. Each death demanded revenge, and each revenge brought new bloodshed. For Redbone and Blueface, these weren't just random battles, they were opportunities to prove themselves as the strongest leaders their gangs had ever seen. Control of the streets meant control of money, power, and reputation, and neither man was willing to back down. The turning point came with the death of Terrence Lil T. Moore, Redbone's closest ally and childhood friend. Lil T had been more than just a soldier in the Bloods. He was family, someone who had grown up alongside Redbone and fought beside him in countless street wars. When Lil T was gunned down in a drive-by shooting, suspicion immediately fell on the Crip. No one could prove it, but the timing, the method, and the whispers on the streets all pointed toward Blueface's crew. For Redbone, this was not just an attack on his gang, but a personal strike at his heart. Grief quickly turned into rage. Redbone swore that he would make the Crips pay for what they had done, even if it meant sparking a war that would consume the entire city. His men, fueled by loyalty and anger, rallied behind him, ready to spill blood in Lil T's name. For the Bloods, this was not just about territory anymore, it was about revenge, honor, and sending a message that no one could cross Marcus Redbone Carter without paying the ultimate price. For Blueface, Lil T's death was a calculated move, a way to weaken the Bloods by removing their second in command. But he underestimated the depth of Redbone's fury. What was meant to cripple the Bloods instead ignited them. The streets of South Los Angeles were about to run red and blue, and the rivalry that had been simmering for years was about to explode into something far deadlier than anyone had imagined. Would you like me to expand Chapter 2 to 600 words as well, keeping the same suspenseful flow? By the early 1990s, the rivalry between the Bloods and the Crips had transformed South Los Angeles into a battleground where every night brought new casualties. Marcus Redbone Carter, still grieving the loss of his closest friend Lil T, unleashed a wave of violence that spread fear across the neighborhoods. His mission was not just revenge, it was domination. To him, the Crips had crossed a line that could never be forgiven, and he wanted to ensure that every blue rag was reminded of the price for touching someone close to him. Under his command, the Bloods struck with precision and fury. They targeted known Crip corners, ambushed cars late at night, and stormed houses where rival members were believed to hide. The attacks were relentless, leaving bodies on sidewalks, cars riddled with bullets, and entire families living in terror. Derek Blueface Johnson did not sit back quietly. While Redbone ruled with raw aggression, Blueface preferred calculated moves. He studied Redbone's patterns, waited for weaknesses, and then struck when least expected. One of his most brutal operations came at a popular nightclub where several Blood members were celebrating a successful deal. Blueface's men stormed the venue, and within minutes the music was drowned by gunfire. 5 Bloods were left dead, and many more injured. It was a message carved into the night that Blueface was just as ruthless as his rival. The war spilled into everyday life. Children were caught in crossfires walking to school, shopkeepers closed their stores early, and families buried loved ones with no sense of justice. The sound of gunshots became so common that residents stopped reacting to them. South LA became a city trapped under the shadow of 2 colors, red and blue, with no safe space in between. Police patrols increased, but they were always too late. By the time law enforcement arrived at crime scenes, the shooters were gone, leaving only shell casings and lifeless bodies behind. As the violence escalated, Redbone's inner circle began to show cracks. Unknown to him, Samuel "Snake" Davis, one of his most trusted lieutenants, was secretly working with the Crips. Snake had grown jealous of Redbone's authority and sought to carve out power for himself. In exchange for money and promises of influence, Snake fed Blueface valuable information about Blood hideouts, upcoming drug shipments, and planned attacks. Every time the Bloods tried to strike, the Crips seemed ready, as if they could predict Redbone's every move. Suspicion grew within the Bloods, but Redbone dismissed it at first, believing the problem was police surveillance. Snake's betrayal made the Bloods weaker by the day. Several operations failed, costing Redbone both territory and men. The frustration made him increasingly paranoid, and he began punishing even minor mistakes with violence. His reputation for fear grew, but so did whispers of doubt among his followers. For Blueface, Snake's betrayal was a weapon more powerful than any gun. With the inside information, he was able to set ambushes that crushed Blood crews before they could even load their weapons. But betrayal was a dangerous game, and Snake underestimated how far Redbone's instincts could reach. Though Redbone had no proof, he began to feel that someone close was feeding his enemy. The tension inside the Bloods became just as dangerous as the Crips outside. Men who had once stood side by side began to mistrust one another, each wondering if the other was the traitor. Through all this bloodshed, the rivalry was no longer about territory or money. It became personal, a duel of pride between 2 men who would not stop until the other was destroyed. Every act of violence demanded retaliation, and every retaliation dug the grave deeper for the city itself. By 1993, South Los Angeles was on fire, and the war between Marcus "Redbone" Carter and Derek "Blueface" Johnson was only tightening its grip. Do you want me to expand Chapter 3 to 600 words next, keeping the same intense flow? By 1995, the rivalry had become more than just a gang war. It was a calculated struggle for survival. The streets of South Los Angeles were littered with the scars of years of violence, and both the Bloods and the Crips were bleeding resources. Law enforcement had intensified its presence, and every move became riskier. For Marcus "Redbone" Carter, the only path forward was to outsmart Derek "Blueface" Johnson. He knew brute force had carried him this far, but to finish the war, he would need precision. What he didn't realize was that a trap was already being set against him. Blueface had grown tired of waiting for the Bloods to destroy themselves. Using Samuel "Snake" Davis as his inside man, he devised a plan to eliminate Redbone once and for all. Snake, who had successfully fed him information for months, was tasked with luring Redbone into a staged drug deal. The idea was simple: promise Redbone a high-value shipment, then surround him with armed Crips ready to erase him from the map. For Blueface, it was the perfect opportunity to remove the last obstacle to his total control, but Redbone had survived too many betrayals to ignore his instinct. The losses he had suffered weighed heavily on his mind, and the feeling that someone close to him was responsible grew stronger every day. Snake's behavior, once trusted, now seemed suspicious. The way he spoke, the way he pushed Redbone to attend the deal himself, the urgency in his tone, all of it planted doubt in Redbone's mind. He didn't reveal his suspicions, but he quietly set his own plan in motion. The night of the meeting, Snake led Redbone to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. The setting was perfect for an ambush, isolated, dark, and far from any police patrol. Snake believed he had outsmarted his leader, but what he didn't know was that Redbone had already planted hidden shooters around the perimeter. The moment Snake signaled to the Crips hiding outside, chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the warehouse, bullets tearing through the walls as both gangs clashed in a storm of violence. Snake was killed almost instantly, his body collapsing in a pool of blood before he even realized the trap had backfired. Several Crips fell as Redbone's hidden men rained bullets on them, but victory came at a cost. The Bloods lost many soldiers in the crossfire, and Redbone himself barely escaped with his life. When the smoke cleared, the warehouse was a graveyard of bodies, the air heavy with the smell of gunpowder and betrayal. The death of Snake confirmed what Redbone had suspected all along, but it also revealed how deeply his organization had been compromised. The Crips had been fed intelligence for months, and the damage could not be undone. Trust inside the Bloods shattered completely, and even loyal members began questioning whether their leader could still guide them to survival. Redbone's paranoia intensified, and his temper became explosive. Where once he inspired fear in rivals, now he inspired fear within his own men. Blueface, on the other hand, survived the failed ambush and escaped into the shadows of the night. For him, Snake's death was a blow, but it wasn't the end. He still had numbers, connections, and the ability to rebuild. More importantly, the warehouse incident drew the attention of law enforcement in ways neither side had anticipated. The scale of the shootout forced police and federal agencies to take stronger action, putting both gangs under closer surveillance than ever before. The warehouse betrayal marked a turning point in the war. The Bloods were weakened by internal mistrust, while the Crips were shaken by the loss of their inside man. Yet the rivalry refused to die. For Redbone and Blueface, it was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy, about proving who was the true king of the street. The city was now bracing itself for the final chapter, one that would not end in a fair fight, but in a twist that neither man could see coming. Do you want me to now expand Chapter 4 to 600 words, making it the most shocking and intense conclusion of the story? In 1997, South Los Angeles was on the verge of collapse from years of violence. The Bloods and the Crips had turned entire neighborhoods into war zones, and ordinary families were trapped between gunfire and fear. Law enforcement could no longer ignore the bloodshed that spread like wildfire. It was then that federal authorities launched Operation Street Justice, a coordinated plan designed to dismantle both gangs from the inside out. Undercover agents infiltrated their circles, wiretaps recorded conversations, and informants were paid to deliver evidence. Every move the gangs made was being watched, and every bullet fired gave law enforcement another reason to strike. Marcus Redbone Carter knew the walls were closing in. His crew was smaller now, weakened by betrayals, shootouts, and years of non-stop warfare. Yet he refused to see himself as defeated. To him, this was not the end, but the beginning of his final stand. He dreamed of one last strike against Derek Blueface Johnson, the man he held responsible for Lil T's death and the endless cycle of blood that followed. Redbone believed that killing Blueface before the authorities took him down would secure his legacy as the Blood who never bowed to anyone. Blueface, however, had already shifted his strategy. Unlike Redbone, he wasn't willing to die for loyalty or reputation. He had built his career on cunning, and now he used that same skill to secure his own escape. Quietly, he reached out to federal agents, offering information in exchange for his freedom. Every detail he provided, the locations of stash houses, names of leaders, and drug routes, brought the FBI closer to dismantling both gangs. For Blueface, betraying his own organization wasn't weakness, it was survival. While his men continued to believe he was preparing for war, he was already signing the paperwork that would guarantee him a new life under protection. The Bloods had no knowledge of this betrayal. Redbone prepared for his last strike, gathering the few loyal men he had left. They armed themselves heavily and mapped out a plan to storm a Crips stronghold. But before the attack could even begin, the FBI moved in. Federal agents swarmed safe houses, raided apartments, and stormed corners in a citywide sweep. Sirens and helicopters filled the night sky as dozens of gang leaders were dragged into custody. The crackdown was merciless, designed to cut the head off both snakes at once. Redbone was caught completely off guard. Agents surrounded his home before dawn,
battering down the door as he tried to reach for a gun. He was wrestled to the ground, his face pressed into the floor while officers shouted commands. For a man who had lived by violence, the end came not in a blaze of gunfire but in handcuffs and silence. His men were rounded up, his weapons seized, and his reign reduced to a case file stacked on a federal prosecutor's desk. News of Blueface's disappearance spread quickly, but the truth was stranger than rumor. While many believed he had fled the city, in reality he was already under federal protection, preparing to be relocated with a new identity. To the streets, it looked as though he had simply vanished, untouchable and undefeated. The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet. Crips who had once followed him without question, now realized they had been sacrificed for his freedom, but it was too late. By the time the truth reached them, Blueface was gone. The war that had spilled so much blood ended not with one leader standing over the other, but with betrayal that destroyed both sides. Redbone, the man who swore never to bow, spent the rest of his life behind bars, his name whispered as both legend and warning. Blueface, the man who built an empire through manipulation, walked away free but forever branded as a traitor to the very streets that made him. South Los Angeles, scarred by years of killings, carried the weight of their rivalry long after they were gone. Families mourned, neighborhoods struggled to rebuild, and the colors red and blue remained a reminder of a time when two men's war consumed an entire city.